Discuss the impact that this pandemic is having on Native populations, Melanie Yazzie. She's an assistant professor of Native American Studies at the University of New Mexico. She's also a citizen of the Navajo Nation. Welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, of course. Melanie, I want to start on a personal note. How do you see the pandemic affecting the Navajo Nation and what's being done to stop its spread?
Yeah, so the Navajo Nation has actually done incredible work, I think, to stop the spread. The rates of infection in the Navajo Nation are higher than some states in the United States. And compared to the size of the population, which is around 325,000, I think those numbers are pretty staggering. And so the president of the Navajo Nation has taken remarkable measures, I think, to protect the people, to protect citizens of the Navajo Nation in this time of pandemic. Of course, the way that it's affecting Native tribes, as you described earlier, the housing crisis that we face chronically, as well as poor health care in general, I think has really been exacerbated by the pandemic.
So the federal government is setting aside for Indigenous peoples some $8 billion from the $2.2 trillion stimulus bill. Is this enough? And how is it trickling to tribal lands?
Sure, so it's not enough. Tribes originally were actually trying to get 2 to 4 times as much and told Congress and the Trump administration that they needed considerably more money. To my knowledge, this was actually one of the very last pieces that went into the stimulus bill and had to be fought for incredibly hard by tribes who are lobbying at Congress, as well as Democratic senators and representatives. And so it was very difficult to actually get the administration to give tribes the amount that they received. And so the $8 billion they're getting through the stabilization fund is actually going to be addressing COVID-19 specific issues, but there's an additional $2 billion through a different kind of appropriations process that tribes will have access to. How tribes are going to receive the funds is still an open-ended question. My understanding is that the Department of Treasury and the Department of the Interior, which administers the Bureau of Indian Affairs and kind of federal relations with tribes, are having meetings, had a meeting on April 9th and April 2nd with tribes about how to assess their need and then how to distribute the funds.
Now, even before the pandemic, access to food already an issue for Native Americans. What's the food infrastructure like now?
The pandemic, I think, has really just shown us and highlighted the mass inequities and disparities that Native people already face across the board, from healthcare to education to housing to access to food to income to lack of infrastructure. And so 25% of all Native households, right, these aren't just individuals, these are households, as you said earlier. A household can have 5 to 15 people in it. So we need to think about the large percentage of Native people when we're talking about kind of thinking about statistics through households, but 25% of Native households are food insecure. Only 15% of the food that is available to Native people in reservations and even in urban settings is fresh and nutritious. And so most of that is processed food, which of course leads to the high rates of heart disease and diabetes and asthma that then increase our risk even more, right, for COVID-19 and our mortality rate. And so we live in food deserts, right? Food deserts are where we don't have access to nutritional fresh food on a regular basis. And so food disappearing, there's even less fresh food, right? So the numbers are just kind of snowballing now that the pandemic has hit.
We mentioned earlier that the income from casinos is a huge economic driver for Indigenous communities. Talk to us about the ramifications of this lost income during the pandemic.
I mean, it's huge, right? Because casinos, I read a statistic actually a few days ago, and I didn't even know this. Tribally owned casinos are the 13th largest employer in the United States. So tribally owned casinos aren't just sources of revenue for tribal nations, they're also sources of jobs for somewhere between 600,000 to 1 million Americans, so non-native and non-tribal members. And so for tribal casinos to be shut down right now has a massive effect, not just on tribal economies, but on the U.S. economy in general. And so when we're talking about a stimulus package, right, and the fact that it was really difficult to get the administration to give funding to tribes, the administration really needs to be thinking about tribes and tribal sovereignty in this moment. It's helping to bolster the larger U.S. economy. It's not just about tribes and their self-interest.
I want to delve into this issue a bit more. Can you explain more generally the economic relationship between Native American tribes and the federal government?
Historically, the most kind of robust forms of tribal sovereignty that Indigenous nations have been able to practice in the United States have been through economic self-determination. So being able to develop gaming, like casinos, for example, or have control over resources. So, for example, coal mining or uranium mining, which is something that my nation, the Navajo Nation, has practiced for almost 100 years as central to its economic development platform. And so I think in general, when we think about nation states having sovereignty and having control and having a robust political economy, they need to be able to have control over their economic resources to do what they need to with them. And generally, what has happened is that historically the relationship between the U.S. government and tribes is one in which the U.S. government interferes constantly in tribal affairs and really prevents Native nations from being able to practice a really robust form of tribal sovereignty. And so, even though tribes, kind of by law, by federal law, are supposed to have a large measure of control over their economic processes, just their economy, what happens is that the US government often interferes and has created mostly a relationship of dependency where tribes really depend upon something like the stimulus package, right, to help bail them out in these kinds of situations. And so there's sort of this quasi-independence and quasi-sovereignty that I think when it comes to the economy doesn't really work for the benefit of tribes.
Melanie, along that same lines of autonomy and sovereignty, do federal safety guidelines such as the lockdowns and business closures apply also to tribal reservations, or are they free to set their own measures?
So tribal nations, according to federal Indian law and federal Indian policy, it's a complex labyrinth of laws about what tribes are allowed to do versus kind of the rules they're supposed to follow that the federal government mandates. In this case, tribes do not have to follow what the federal guidelines are. But I do want to point out that, in fact, the stay-at-home policies that have been enacted in most of the states in the United States, that the states have actually been far more proactive and have done much more than the federal government or the Trump administration. And on top of that, tribal nations have taken this pandemic very seriously in their role in preventing the spread, and they themselves have even done more than certain states have. So, for example, South Dakota, which to my knowledge still has not established a stay-at-home order, the Lakota and Dakota tribes in that state have done much more than the state of South Dakota and much more than the federal government to protect not only tribal members, to provide health care to non-tribal members, and to do everything that they can to prevent the spread. And so in some ways, I think the federal government could learn from what tribes are doing much more than the other way around.
Very encouraging to hear. We so appreciate your insight, Melanie Yazzie, Assistant Professor of Native American Studies at the University of New Mexico.
Thank you so much.